Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 4 lecture. So now we're turning our attention to the sound element of poetry, and that means we have to talk a little bit more about rhyme and meter and other aspects of form, which were very, very important in sort of traditional, older poetry prior to the 20th century. As we're going to talk about later, now in contemporary poetry, we don't find as much of these different aspects of form. Instead, we might find a lot more free verse, and we'll talk about what that means, but all poetry has a very important sound element. Whether it's sort of written in an older traditional format or if it's something newer and more contemporary, regardless, when we read poetry, we're always going to notice rhythm. We're always going to notice a certain type of sound pattern emerging in most poems that we read. And I would encourage you guys, as you start reading the poems that are assigned for this week, think a little bit about music. Draw some comparisons between song lyrics and lyric poetry. So you can see by the similarity in the names that there's always been a close link between music and poetry. Like I mentioned back in part 1, we can really trace the origins of poetry, at least in the Western world, back to ancient Greece and these festivals where there would often be music, and certain parts of those ancient poems would often be sung, whereas other parts might have just been recited. But if we think about how song lyrics work, if we think about the rhythm, the pattern that we can often find in song lyrics, the same rhythms and patterns that will often make us want to sing or dance along, a lot of those same elements, those same kinds of aspects can be found in a lot of lyric poetry. You're going to find that same kind of pattern. You're going to find rhythm, and it's often going to, a lot of poetry that we read might feel and sound a lot like a song. There might be that sort of musical quality. There'll be a certain flow. There'll be a rhythm that you can follow and analyze, and that's often an important part of interpreting and analyzing poetry. So like the book says, poetry highlights language really more than any other form of literature. Of course, all literature relies on language. All literature uses language, otherwise it could not exist. But because of the short nature of a lot of lyric poetry, because like we've been saying, a lot of lyric poems tend to be relatively short and they tend to focus on certain impressions, experiences, feelings. So because there's less of a narrative emphasis, we can really focus more on specific features of language. So we were talking about that with imagery back in part 1, but that also that also allows us to pay more attention to figurative language, things like metaphors and similes, other types of figures of speech. We're going to maybe notice more of those, or a higher percentage of those in poetry. They're present in other forms of literature too, just like imagery is. But again, it's going to be more concentrated in poetry because of the nature of poetry. And we're also going to notice aspects of sound a lot more with poetry than we would with, say, fiction or a lot of modern drama. That's not to say, going back to fiction, a lot of fiction sounds great. It might sound rhythmic in a certain way. It might sound very pleasing to the ear. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of really beautiful prose out there. Really good writers can often spin very lovely prose, but the sound aspect just isn't as important there, because typically in prose we don't have a rhyme scheme, we don't have an established meter. So the look and the sound of the words and the sentences, they don't matter quite as much as they matter in poetry. Again, often with stories, if we're looking at short stories or novels, our focus will often be on the narrative, the plot, the theme, the characters, the setting. We're not always paying as much attention to the actual language, the words and the sentences that we see on the page. But in poetry, we really can't escape those basic building blocks. We have to pay close attention to individual words, phrases, and sentences, and that in turn allows us to think about imagery and about sound and sense, to use the terms we find in the book. So when they're talking about sound and sense, they're largely talking about rhyme scheme, meter, and some other stuff like stanzas, and even the way lines get broken or arranged within a poem. So let's go through all of that, but I want to spend a little bit of extra time on meter. And like I said, we're going to take a look at the first line of Annabelle Lee, and we're going to scan it. That means to figure out what kind of meter Poe is using there in the first line. So we'll get to that in a moment, but let's start with something a little easier, a little bit more familiar, and that is rhyme scheme. A lot of us can easily identify rhyme. And again, music helps us with this. A lot of popular music employs rhyme scheme. That's another similarity between poetry and music. So a lot of poetry written before the 20th century, a lot of older, more traditional, more formal poetry written prior to the 20th century did employ a rhyme scheme, but a rhyme scheme has never been a requirement of poetry. You can always find poems, even way back in the day, that did not rhyme, and a lot of poetry written today does not rhyme, or at least does not have a regular, consistent rhyme scheme. There might be some occasional rhyme, but it's not sustained, it's not maintained throughout the entire poem. But in a lot of older poetry, we will find set, established rhyme schemes. But just remember that it's not a requirement, and it never has been. But it was a lot more common back in the old days. So back then and now, if we do see rhyme scheme, typically it's going to be what we call end rhyme. And that means the end of lines will rhyme. There's lots of different rhyme schemes. A, B, CD, CD is a very common one that we would find, for example, in the Shakespearean sonnet that I posted this week. But there's a lot of different ones. We're not going to get into all of them, but you can usually figure it out just by looking at the song lyrics or the poem. Sometimes the end of the first line will rhyme with the end of the third line, or maybe the end of the first line rhymes with the end of the second line. You can usually figure it out just by closely examining each individual line. So we usually find end rhyme. So the rhyme is at the end of the lines. But that's not the only type of rhyme that we can find. We can also identify what's called internal rhyme. So that means words or phrases maybe in the middle of a line, not necessarily at the end, but elsewhere. Maybe some of those sounds and words or phrases can also rhyme. And a lot of internal rhyme will be created by assonance and consonants. So those terms are mentioned in the chapter. Assonance just means repeated vowel sounds, and consonants means repeated consonant sounds. So you'll find a lot of that in poetry as well. These don't create exact, true rhyme. But when you find that poets are repeating certain vowel sounds or certain consonant sounds, that creates a pattern. You're going to notice that. That creates a certain sound effect. And if you read the poem out loud, or even if you're just reading it silently, you need to really pay attention to what it sounds like. How do those sound effects play out as you read or even listen to the poem? Some of these poems, you're going to be able to find them read aloud online. and you might be able to listen. That's also a good way to get closer to the text. You can read it and listen to it. A lot of poems demand that you read them multiple times. So you will be able to find some internal rhyme. Some things in the middle of lines will rhyme on occasion. And then also we'll be able to find what's called slant rhyme. I think that's the term the book uses, and they also provide a nice example of slant rhyme, also sometimes called I rhyme. These are words that don't necessarily rhyme, like they don't really rhyme. It's not a true exact rhyme, but the words sound somewhat similar, often because of assonance or consonants. Oftentimes these words will contain similar or some of the same letters, or they might contain similar vowel or consonant sounds. So even though they don't rhyme, having the words paired up still kind of helps to contribute to that pattern, that rhythm that we feel as we read or listen to the poem. So the example they give in the book of a slant rhyme, 2 words, love and prove. Now, if you hear those words or say those words yourselves, you'll notice that they don't really rhyme, not in a traditional classic way. That's not a true rhyme, but it's a slant rhyme because they're making some similar sounds and they have a lot of the same letters. So if you look at those 2 words, love and prove, you'll notice that the letter O appears in both. The letter V and the letter E also appear in both words. Now, the sound is a little different. With love, we're making sort of an sound, and then we end with the V sound, right? And then with prove, that's more of an oo sound, followed by, once again, the V sound. So both words kind of end in similar ways with VE at the end of the words. They make similar sounds at the end. And even though the O's don't sound exactly the same, the O is doing some similar work in both of those words, and then the 2 words have the same ending. So that creates a slant rhyme. Not a true rhyme, but the words just sound kind of similar. And that contributes to the rhythm and the flow, the overall sound effect of the poem. So you guys can look for that stuff in some of the poems that I've assigned, or you might want to take a look at some others because there's a ton of selections, a ton of poetry selections in our book. We're only scratching the surface. But when you find a rhyme scheme, it's not enough to just identify it and say, oh, okay, there it is, I see it. You should also ask yourself, what is the rhyme scheme doing? Like, what is it accomplishing? We've already covered one thing that it does. It creates rhythm. It creates, in some cases, an almost musical effect that sort of creates that sense of momentum that carries you through the reading or listening experience. We know that, but does the rhyme do anything else? Is it somehow working with the actual words and ideas on the page? Is there a relationship between the rhyme scheme and like what the poem is about? Or is there some kind of alignment between the rhyme scheme and certain words or certain ideas? In some cases, the words that rhyme might be repeated, or they might be especially important. They might have some kind of larger symbolic importance. So sometimes the rhyme scheme does more than just create a cool sound. It also has significance to maybe the overall theme of the poem. It might be connected to some of the ideas or feelings, experiences being described in the poem. So you can always ask yourself those questions as well. But remember, repetition is another pattern to look for. I just want to throw that one in there. They don't really get into it much in the book, but that's another pattern, right? Look for words that get repeated. That usually matters. These are all deliberate choices made by the poet, whether we're talking about rhyme, meter, or the repetition of specific words. They're all intentionally done. So if we find patterns like that, they usually mean something, and we can usually interpret them. All right, so let's move on to meter. Another big part of the overall sound effect of poems. So when we're talking about meter, we're really referring to the patterns of syllables and accents that are present in poems. So let me try to explain this. The book doesn't get into it in a lot of detail. They leave all of the heavy lifting to the individual instructors. I don't need you guys to be experts on meter. I just want you to know a little bit. I want you to have a basic understanding because it is an important part of a lot of older traditional poetry. And even though a lot of contemporary poets don't necessarily use meter as much or not as consistently, it still shows up in some interesting ways. And poets can still use it even in kind of a loose way to provide structure, rhythm, and patterns within their text. So again, a lot of poetry written before the 20th century, a lot of older, what we might call formal poetry stuff from like the 1617 up to the 1800s. Just like a lot of that stuff had rhyme schemes, they also employed meter pretty often, not always, but most poetry written back then would have had established meters, just like they had set established rhyme schemes. So what we're talking about with syllables and accents really comes down to this, okay? When poets are working, when they are writing a line of poetry, at least back in the old days, they were often paying very close attention to the number of syllables that they were using in each line and where the emphasis on those syllables would go. So that's all we mean by patterns of syllable and accent. How many syllables do we have per line, okay? And how are we emphasizing those syllables? Or how are we placing, accent on certain syllables versus others? That's really all we're talking about, okay? So let's break this down a little bit more. So when we're analyzing meter, we're really thinking about two things, okay? Number one, we're thinking about the metrical feet that appear in a single line. So when we do meter, we have to go line by line. That's what scansion is. Scansion just means that you are scanning a line to figure out the meter. So the first thing we have to do is figure out what kind of metrical feet are in that line. And then the second thing we do, the first thing we do is figure out what kind of metrical feet we're dealing with. And then the second thing we do is figure out how many metrical feet we have per line. So you're probably asking, what is a metrical foot? I know that sounds weird, but it's just the basic rhythmic unit of poetry. So just think of the metrical foot as like the most basic building block of poetry, even more basic than an individual word, because metrical feet are usually determined by syllables. So we're getting to like the smallest level here, the smallest building block of verse, poetry. And this is, of course, one of the things that makes poetry a lot different than prose, right? Prose doesn't have a rhyme scheme. Prose doesn't usually employ any kind of a meter. So traditionally, when distinguishing between prose and poetry, stuff like this was a big way that we made those distinctions, that we distinguish between fiction and poetry. So in poetry, traditionally, we are using certain kinds of metrical feet, and then we're using a certain amount of metrical feet per line. So that's all we're trying to figure out when we're trying to figure out meter. So there's a lot of different kinds of metrical feet. We don't need to know a lot of them. I just want you to be familiar with some of the most common and popular metrical feet in English language poetry. Because in other languages, they have other traditions, other kinds of metrical feet, and I don't know anything about that stuff. But in English language poetry, we have 4 pretty common, often used metrical feet. The iamb, the trochee, the dactyl, and the anapest. So if you take a look at Annabel Lee, take a moment, in fact, right now to just open up that poem. If you could, open it in your book or just pull it up on your computer screen. Let's just take a look at that first line of the poem. We don't have time to scan all of the lines, but I just want to tackle that first one so we can identify the meter. Okay, so let's start with the I am, because we should be familiar with this. The I am is the most common metrical foot used in English language poetry. And it's pretty simple, right? So metrical feet are little units, okay? And in the case of the I am, the unit consists of just two syllables. One unstressed and one stressed, in that order, okay? Unstressed syllable followed by stressed syllable. That's it. That's all an I am is, okay? So an easy way to think about an I am is just think about the word alone. Alone. Okay, that's a single I am. Okay, that's one word, but it consists of two syllables, right? And notice that the first syllable is unstressed and the second syllable is stressed. That's the way most people say the word alone. Alone. We emphasize the second syllable. Alone. Okay, that's an I am. That's all an I am is. It's a little small metrical foot consisting of two syllables, one unstressed, one stressed, okay? Now, we see I ams all the time in older English language poetry, like Shakespeare stuff. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Okay, let's not even get into the trochee or the dactyl because we're not looking at any of those right now. But let's jump down to the anapest. The anapest is a bigger unit, or it's a bigger metrical foot because it consists of three syllables, okay? Three syllables. Two unstressed syllables followed by one stressed syllable. So it's similar to the I am, it's just a little bit longer. The I am is one unstressed followed by one stressed. The anapest is two unstressed followed by one stressed syllable. Okay, so that's really all we mean by metrical feet. They're actually not as complicated as they sound, but there are a lot of them, and we don't need to know most of them. So just be aware of the I am and be aware of the anapest, because in Annabel Lee, Poe uses both kinds of metrical feet, and he actually uses some other types of metrical feet that we're not even going to get into because we don't have time. But for the first line, we need to be aware of the I am and the anapest because both are present in the first line of Annabel Lee. So let's just take a look, okay? Get that poem in front of you and let's scan the first line. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys, I'm kind of giving it away here at the beginning, but I want you to write this down. In the first line of the poem, we have three anapests followed by one I am. Okay, so just write that down. Three anapests followed by a single I am. Okay, so we're going to be able to double check this simply by counting up syllables. And this is what we have to do when we scan a line of poetry. We have to break it down syllable by syllable in order to identify the meter. So take a look at the first line. You might even be able to find a website that does this for you, but I can kind of do it for you even though I don't have a visual aid. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and identify those three anapests for you. Okay, starting at the very beginning. Okay, so the first one, it was ma. Okay, it was ma. I want you to put a thick line after the M and the A in the word many. Okay, that's our first anapest, and it makes sense, right? We have two unstressed syllables followed by one stressed. So it and was, those are our two unstressed. And then we are emphasizing, we are placing the stress on ma, the beginning of the word many. Because, of course, the word many consists of two syllables. So we are stopping our first anapest with the first syllable of that word. And we're emphasizing that syllable. It was ma. Okay, so put a line after the A. All right, and there's our first anapest. And you can see it. Two unstressed syllables followed by one stressed. Okay, let's move on to the second anapest. All right, it starts with ni, the ny, the ending part of the word many. Okay, we're not stressing that. Okay, so ni and ma. All right, so we're ending the second anapest just like we ended the first. We're once again emphasizing the first part of the word many, the first syllable of that word. Okay, so it's the same as the first anapest. We have two unstressed syllables followed by ma. Okay, so put another dark line after the A in the second many. So there, right away, we see repetition. We see that there's repetition throughout this poem. So definitely pay attention to that, all right? So we've just identified our second anapest, all right? And our third anapest, again, starts with ni, followed by A. So those are our two unstressed syllables, ni and A. And then the word year, that's stressed. That syllable is emphasized. Ni a year. Okay, I'm overdoing it a bit just so you guys can hear it. We're emphasizing the word year. Okay, that's where the emphasis should fall if we're reading this according to Poe's meter. Okay, so then I want you to put another line after year. Okay, because that's where the third anapest ends. Okay, so just do the math there. You see that we have three anapests, each one consisting of 3 syllables apiece. Right? So far we have 9 syllables in this line. And we're following the same pattern of emphasis because we're sticking with anapests, right? Unstressed, unstressed, and then a stressed syllable. And then we start over. Unstressed syllable, stressed. And we do that 3 times. And then we get to the end of the line and we have one lonely word. One lonely word consisting of 2 syllables. So maybe you've already figured out that what we have at the end of this first line is not an anapest, right? The math doesn't make sense. What we have at the end is an I am. Remember, because the I am is a metrical foot consisting of just 2 syllables, unstressed followed by stressed. So the word ago works just like the word alone. We don't stress the first syllable of the word, we stress the second syllable. Ago, right? Ago. That's how the line ends. So if we're adding it all up, we have 3 anapests followed by 1 I am. So that's a little tricky. A lot of poets would stick with anapests throughout the entire poem, or they would stick with I ams throughout the entire poem, but Poe likes to switch it up. Poe likes to use different types of metrical feet and different numbers of them. So his meter changes a few times throughout the poem. Okay, but just be aware of some of the basic things that he's doing. So in that first line, we have 3 anapests followed by 1 I am. Okay, great. So we've taken care of step 1 of our meter analysis, our scansion. We figured out what kind of metrical feet we are dealing with. And in the process, we also counted them up. So now we've done the second part as well. We know how many metrical feet are in this line. So because there's 4, and because, remember, 3 anapests and 1 I am. So that's a total of 4 metrical feet in this line. Okay? And because 3 of the 4 are anapests, we're going to call the meter here anapestic tetrameter. That sounds really complicated, but it just means that the dominant metrical foot at work here is the anapest. We know that we also have 1 I am, but there's obviously more anapests than there are I ams, so the edge goes to the anapest. And we also know that there's a total of 4 metrical feet. So think of tetra, right? That means 4. So that second word is identifying the number of metrical feet, right? So in this case, we're mostly using anapests, and then we have 4. So that's where the tetrameter comes in. Anapestic tetrameter. But at other times in this poem, Poe starts using anapestic trimeter, which means the line just has 3 metrical feet, and in several of the lines, he just has 3 anapaests. So he has lines like that, where it's just 3 anapaests, and then so that's anapaestic trimeter. That means there's 3 metrical feet per line. Okay, so he does that sometimes, and he even does at times some iambic trimeter. So sometimes he uses the iamb for most of the line, and he'll have 3 different iambs in the same line. Okay, so he switches it up, and then he uses some other types of metrical feet. Like I said, we don't need to worry about that. He even has some split lines, and that means you have an even split in the same line between 2 different kinds of metrical feet. So in some of his lines, he'll have like 2 anapaests and 2 iambs. So that's a true split line. Not a lot of poets would always do that. That's a very complex, very elaborate structure and form and sort of sound effect that he's creating with all of these different kinds of meter. But again, a lot of the sound effect relates directly to the emotional impact that this poem is supposed to have on readers or listeners. So you can never divorce the sound from the meaning. Right? The meter matters. The meter creates a certain rhythm, a certain sense of intensity or movement, and that very much relates to what the poem is all about, the actual theme of the poem, the meaning of the words and sentences. So I think it's kind of fun to do a little bit of scansion. Again, scansion's just the art of figuring out the meter of an individual line of poetry. But with a lot of poems, it's easier than this one, because once you figure it out with the first line, it will often stay the same. So not all poets are doing what Poe's doing here and changing and doing a lot of weird stuff line to line. So for example, just to go back to the iamb for a moment, the most common type of meter in English language poetry of all, the most common of all, is iambic pentameter. So when you read any of Shakespeare's famous sonnets, I posted one of them for us to look at this week. Those are always written in iambic pentameter. A lot of other traditional, formal, sort of classic poetry in the English language was written in iambic pentameter. And that's easy to identify. We already know what an iamb is. So when we're looking at iambic pentameter, that just means that each line will have 5 iambs. Okay? 5 iambs for a total of 10 syllables, right? Because we know that each iamb consists of 2 syllables, so 5 times 2 equals 10. So there's a total of 10 syllables per line, and we're alternating unstressed and stressed syllables throughout. That's a very familiar, recognizable, and comfortable meter, and a lot of songs use it. I might do this later in the week. I'm kind of on the verge of going on vacation right now, but if you guys want me to, this is only kind of brought back nowadays through popular demand. But I can show you guys even some examples of like not super contemporary, but like fairly contemporary, like rap music and other popular songs that use iambic pentameter. Not always super consistently, but and I don't even know if it's always deliberate, but a lot of songwriters use it because it's easy. It kind of approximates speech a little bit more than a lot of other meters do. And it's just been used for so long in the English language. A lot of our popular music, a lot of our popular poetry from previous eras, would have been written in iambic pentameter. So even if we don't know exactly what it is, we've heard it. It sounds kind of good to us, it sounds good to English speakers, and it sounds kind of familiar. But again, once you figure out what kind of metrical foot you're dealing with, like if you think you're dealing with an iamb, if you think the poet's mostly using iambs, then you can just count up the number of syllables per line, and that will tell you if it's pentameter or tetrameter or trimeter or whatever. Not all of us necessarily want to do that when we read poetry, and like they kind of indicate in the book, you don't really have to possess a deep understanding of meter in order to appreciate poetry, in order to successfully analyze poetry. But if you want to pay close attention to sound, paying attention to meter and rhyme scheme and stuff like assonance and consonants, all of that does help. All right, so let's try to speed up here and talk very quickly about form and some of the other aspects of form. So again, like I was saying earlier, older poetry often followed certain established poetic forms. And a lot of that poetic form would be based on stuff like rhyme scheme and meter and the length of stanzas and how lines would be broken. All of that's kind of a part of traditional, kind of old-timey poetic form. Nowadays, a lot of contemporary poets will still use a lot of these things, but they'll kind of use them a little bit selectively. They don't always use them as consistently as older poets. So just an easy example, if you look at that sonnet from Shakespeare that I posted this week, that's a great example of what I'm talking about. So in previous eras, a lot of poets, not always, but oftentimes, they would work within sort of established genres of poetry. Ballads, elegies, odes, sonnets, villanelles. There's all kinds of different types of traditional poetry. And then in other languages, they have other sort of different traditions. But those are all examples of English language varieties of poems that you would have seen in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. We don't see them as much today, but they're still around. People like to write haikus. That poetic form came from Japan, but we use it a lot in the English language. So some of these forms are still around, and one of the forms that kind of has survived and people still use it is the sonnet. So some of you might already be familiar with the sonnet. There's different kinds of sonnets. There's Italian sonnets. We're not going to worry about those. We're focused on the ones that were kind of codified into law by Shakespeare and some of his contemporaries around, the end of the 1500s, early 1600s. So to write a sort of classic Shakespearean sonnet, as the poet, you have to follow some very specific rules pertaining to rhyme, meter, and stanzas. So this is all part of the form of the sonnet. And back in the old days, you had to stick to the rules. You had to stick to the form. So the sonnet would consist of 14 lines, okay? It had to be 14 lines, and it had to be broken up into 3 stanzas and then a final couplet, okay? So the 3 stanzas would all be quatrains. That's just a 4-line stanza. So again, do the math, 3 quatrains, okay, for a total of 12 lines, and then that's followed by a closing couplet. That means just 2 lines joined together, okay, for a total of 14 lines, all right? So we have to follow that rule, okay? So we're following certain rules about stanzas. We can't just create different length stanzas. We have to have 3 4-line stanzas followed by a final couplet. Okay, our meter has to be iambic pentameter, and we can't change it. We can't do some weird stuff with anapests like Poe's doing. And it's some people would, and it's usually fine. And we don't always even read anapests as anapests, but generally we're going to stick to iambic pentameter throughout. We're not going to change our meter like Poe does in Annabel Lee. And our rhyme scheme is going to be A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D throughout the 3 quatrains. But then when we get to the closing couplet, they rhyme together. Those 2 lines go together, okay, at the very end of the poem. All right, so we have to follow that rhyme scheme. We have to follow a specific meter, and we even have to follow rules about how we organize our stanzas. And that's the classic sonnet. But nowadays, a lot of poets, if they're going to write a sonnet, they might follow some of those rules, but not all the time, and they're going to sort of do their own thing. They're going to put their own spin on the sonnet. They're not necessarily going to stick to all of those traditional aspects of form. But again, a lot of that stuff contributes to the sound, like we've been saying, the rhyme, the meter, but then also the way the stanzas are arranged, even the way the words look on the page, all of that, even if it's not specific to sound, it's all affecting our experience as readers. It's all affecting the way we think, the way we feel as we read the poem. So it's all very deliberate. And again, there's a certain kind of logical sequence that sonnets are often supposed to follow. Like they're supposed to introduce a problem or a conflict, and then by the end, they've kind of resolved it. So again, there's always a relationship between form and content, the actual content, the meaning of the poem, what it's about, what it's saying. And then there's the sound, there's the appearance, there's all those features of language. So we can look at both of those areas, but we need to remember that they're always related. Meaning and sound are always going to be related, and the sound is always going to affect our experience. But again, we'll extend that to the visual side, like the way it looks on the page, the way the stanzas look. That matters. And we're also going to talk a little bit more about lineation, the way that lines actually get broken. Okay, that also affects both sound and visual appearance. But let's just wrap up with form and just understand that nowadays a lot of poets use what we call free verse. Okay, and free verse means that we're not really following all of these specific rules that used to govern certain poetic forms, like sonnets, like odes, like elegies. Annabel Lee is sometimes called a ballad. So it is kind of an example of an older type of poetic form, but ballads were kind of loose with rules. You didn't have to use a specific meter, although there were certain meters that appeared a lot in ballads. And in fact, Emily Dickinson, in the poem that you guys read from her a couple of weeks ago, she's using a meter that was commonly found in lullabies and nursery rhymes and ballads. It was very sing-song, a very sing-song kind of rhythm and pattern. You might have noticed that when reading it. But again, we don't need to get into all of that. Just know that back in the old days, those forms mattered. And a lot of poets worked within those established forms. Nowadays, with contemporary poetry, we have a lot more free verse, which means there often will not be a consistent set rhyme scheme. There often will not be a consistent set meter. But that doesn't mean that free verse doesn't have any structure. It doesn't mean that free verse is without rhythm or some kind of pattern or various sound effects. It's just that writers are a little bit more free to kind of, do what they want and put their own personal spin on the text. They don't have to follow so many rules, but even if they're not using consistent rhyme and meter, sometimes they're using stuff that almost sounds like a consistent meter. A lot of contemporary poets will use slant rhyme, right? So they might not have a really consistent in-rhyme scheme, but they use slant rhyme. They might not have a consistent meter, but a lot of their lines might be roughly the same number of syllables. You guys should notice that in some of the contemporary poetry that we're looking at this week. Like if you look at En Route to Bangladesh, Another Crisis of Faith, one of our contemporary poems, it's free verse, but a lot of the lines, at least early on, are somewhere between 4 and 6 syllables. And then later in the poem, the lines get a little bit longer, and they range more like somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 7 to 9 or even 10 syllables on the high end. So a lot of the lines will kind of mirror each other a little bit in terms of length, in terms of some of the sounds, some of the patterns within those lines. And I'm not exactly sure how the poem looks in your books. I'm using an electronic version of our book, and in mine, the poem is broken up into individual couplets. So the whole poem consists of little 2-line groupings, which I think is great. But I've also seen it online where they don't do that, and they don't put white space between each couplet or each little 2-line grouping. But you can look at the indentation and kind of sense that we are kind of, not really. We're kind of using couplets, but not in a traditional, official, formal way, but kind of. And she's not quite using meter, but she is using some consistency with her syllables and her line length. So there is structure there. There is a rhythm. There is a lot of pattern. But she's not using any specific traditional poetic form like a sonnet or, a ballad or something like that. And that's very common for contemporary poets. They'll sort of borrow some of those old tools, a little bit of rhyme, a little bit of meter, maybe some slant rhyme, maybe something cool with the way we arrange our stanzas. We're going to have patterns in our stanzas, but they're going to just kind of do what they want for the most part instead of following a whole lot of rules. As a result, some people will claim that a lot of contemporary poetry that's written in just totally free verse, like not a lot of structure to it, maybe it's all just one big stanza, there's not a lot of recognizable shape or form. Some people will call that prose poems. They say that might sound and look and read a little bit like prose. So some of those sharp dividing lines between prose, like short stories and novels, and poetry, some of that's getting blurred now, because in the old days we could always distinguish poetry by looking for rhyme or meter or stanzaic divisions, and now that stuff isn't as common. So some free verse might sound a little bit like something you could see in a short story. And some people think that's weird, some people think that's cool, some people think that's totally unimportant, and it's just whatever you like. But just be aware of some of the changes that have occurred really over the last century. Over the last, roughly 100 years, we've really turned to a lot more free verse, and we've left behind some of those older traditional poetic forms. But again, they're still around, and some people still use them. So just remember stanzas. That's the basic, grouping of lines within a poem. They kind of work like paragraphs work in prose fiction. And like the book says, the word stanza actually comes from the Italian word for room. So think of each stanza in a poem as kind of functioning like a separate room that has its own relationships, it has its own ideas, maybe some of its own meanings or effects, but obviously all the rooms work together to create the overall house that is the poem. So you're going to see a lot of weird stuff, especially in contemporary poetry, with the way stanzas are organized. Some stanzas might just consist of a single line, like I just said. Some poems are just one big stanza, and there's just one. In other cases, they're going to be designed or arranged in other ways. But the way those stanzas look, the way those stanzas sound, again, those are always deliberate choices made by the poet. And then our final kind of key element for today, if we're thinking about poetry, is, well, there's two more, really. Lineation, and then I just want to repeat figurative language very quickly. But lineation's important to remember if you're not already familiar with it. That's just a term that refers to how the poet breaks up the lines, like how the individual lines get arranged within stanzas. Okay, so it's the arrangement of individual lines. Sometimes we'll notice that there might be punctuation at the end of lines in some poems. That's not super common, but sometimes you'll see it. It's not uncommon. So sometimes we'll find punctuation at the end of lines. In other cases, there might not be punctuation, but the line still ends at the end, right? We call that an end-stop line. Like whatever thought or idea is being expressed in that line, it kind of stops at the end of the line. That's a classic end-stop line, all right? But in other cases, we're going to see what's called enjambment, okay? And all these terms are in the book. Make sure you're comfortable with them. You might want to get them down in your notes. When lines are enjambed, or when enjambment occurs, that just means a line doesn't stop at the end of the line. It keeps going on to the next line. That thought, that idea, that image, that figure of speech spills over to the next line. It doesn't stop with the previous line. So the line does not stop logically or by any kind of punctuation at the end of the line. It spills over, it continues on to the next line. So the content and the meaning of that line spill over into the next line. So you have to be aware of that, because you have to read that differently than you would read lines that all stopped at the end of the line, right? The way you read in stop lines is different than the way you read in enjambment. So you just need to be aware of that. And that's why sometimes reading the poem a second or even a third time is a good idea. So enjambment will often create, like the book points out, is a sense of like acceleration. It's almost like we're moving fast. Again, we're not pausing as we go from line to line. We're just kind of continuing the thought. So sometimes that can give us kind of a stream of consciousness feeling, or it just makes us think that we're right in the middle of something. Something is continuing. Maybe it's happening rather fast. Enjambment can often make us feel that way. And then finally, the book also mentions caesuras, which are just long pauses that occur in the middle of lines, often created by punctuation. So if you see commas or semicolons or periods or dashes in the middle of a line, of course you need to pause, right? That's like an interruption. It's a pause, it's a break in the middle of the line, and that's never done by accident. Again, that's a deliberate choice. You need to pause for a moment in order to achieve the right sound effect. So you have to pay attention to that too. And sometimes caesuras are not just caused by punctuation, they might just be created by white space. Some contemporary poets might just have blank space in between words, maybe even in between lines. But if it happens in the middle of a line, we call that a caesura, and that pause will often matter. It will often have some kind of significance. And then finally, just don't forget about metaphors, similes, personification. Those are all types of figurative language, figures of speech. And just like imagery, figurative language shows up in fiction, drama, all kinds of literature. But it's most noticeable and it's most common in poetry. So just like you're hunting for imagery, you can also look for interesting metaphors and similes, because a lot of poems will feature them quite heavily. And again, students are sometimes nervous about working with these. Just remember that metaphors and similes in particular, they're just comparisons, right? They are just interesting, creative, inventive ways of making comparisons. That's all a metaphor or a simile is. And a simile just uses words like or as to make that comparison. You know, so a metaphor is just like if somebody died in my family recently and I tell you that my mom is drowning in a sea of grief. That is a metaphor, right? I am not speaking literally. That's not literally true. She's not drowning. She's not in the ocean. I'm not speaking literally. I'm speaking figuratively, right? It's a figure of speech. It's a comparison. I'm comparing the grief that my mom is experiencing as a result of this recent loss. I'm comparing it to somebody drowning in the sea, okay? That's all a metaphor really does. It's just a way to compare two unlike things in an interesting, inventive way. And similes kind of do the same thing, just with slightly different word choice. So if I tell you that I'm fast like a cheetah, I mean, that's not true. That's not a literal statement. Even if I am trying to say that I'm fast, no human can be as fast as a cheetah, but I'm making a comparison, right? I'm telling you, perhaps, I mean, it could also be used for sarcasm if I were to say it, but if I'm being genuine, that's a comparison that I'm making in order to show you, prove to you that I'm fast, right? I'm comparing myself to something that is very different from me, but it's just a sort of more creative way of telling you that I possess a certain quality or I feel a certain way. So remember, in lyric poetry, poets are often trying to tap into feelings, ideas, and experiences. So they might want to compare some of those things to unlike things just to make their point, just to show you how sad they are or how fast they are, right? So pay attention to those figures of speech because we can also analyze those. All right, so I know last time I told you guys that we would discuss the short stories that we read back in week 3, but nobody has time for that at this point. The lecture is way too long. I'm just going to let you guys do that work on your own. We probably won't really have time to discuss the individual examples of literature that we're reading during these weeks, but you guys will have chances very soon to write about them. So that's what really matters. All right, so that's it for poetry. Please join me next week as we explore drama, our third and final traditional category of literature.